Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike Rustici, and we are here to talk about the Tin Can API today. A little bit of housekeeping as we get started. We've got a lot of people on the line here today, so go ahead and put your questions into the question board as we're going along, and we've got Andy, Megan, and Jeff here moderating the discussion and hoping to answer as many of those questions as we can as we go along. If we don't get to all of them, don't worry. We will be posting a recording of this webinar up in the next couple of days, and we're going to do our best to answer all of our questions offline with that post if there are any that we can't get to during the presentation. One other thing, if you're on Twitter, #TinCanAPI is the hashtag for Tin Can, and a separate sidebar conversation, the back channel for this presentation as well. So it's a little bit afternoon now. We're going to just go ahead and start diving into it. So today, what we're talking about is the Tin Can API. But to put that into a little bit of context, what we're really talking about here is plumbing. And I'm going to start off not just with plumbing, but the history of plumbing. And so, who's really excited about the history of plumbing? Let me try to give you a little context and tell you why I'm going to draw that analogy back to SCORM and Tin Can. If you look at SCORM and Tin Can, what they are is they're really things that sit under the hood of a lot of learning systems, and those things aren't always big and bright and sexy when you look at them, but they're fundamentally important. When they're working well, they just kind of disappear, but when they're not working, they cause all kinds of problems and get things a little bit stinky, if you will. So, drawing on my analogy, the history of plumbing. This is where we started back in the medieval times. People had chamber pots, and they would empty their chamber pots into the middle of the street, and it didn't take people very long to realize this was kind of a bad idea. The poor saps walking along the street didn't really have the best experience, and this wasn't a very scalable system to build a society where people are starting to live near each other on. And so fast forward a few hundred years, this is London, sometime around the 1200s, 1300s, and by this time there's a lot of people starting to live together, and so London had some really great innovations. They started bringing in water from conduits from the Tyburn River. They had a whole system of cobs, who were people who were kind of this organized group that carried water to households who couldn't connect into the conduits. They had water wheels. They also developed hundreds of thousands of cesspits to put all these chamber pots into instead of dumping them on the street. And this was a huge improvement. This was a big step forward. This allowed London to build the city that you see here. But if you fast forward a little bit, in 1858, the whole system started to break down. There was too many people, and London had what is called the Great Stink. In 1858 in London, the rainfall was overwhelming, and it basically overwhelmed the primitive plumbing systems that they had in there, overflowing the cesspit, dumping sewage into the Thames River, shutting down Parliament, causing people to evacuate the city, creating a massive cholera outbreak because the plumbing system, the thing holding the city together, broke down. And so an overhaul of the system was in order. And in around that time, a man named Joseph Bazalgette put together the London sewer system. And in retrospect, this system has been called one of the most important advances for health in history. One of the biggest milestones for how we have for public health that we've been through, more important than antibiotics, vaccine, DNA, any of these things. The simple fundamental plumbing, the things you take for granted, the things that are behind the scenes, what matter. They allow us to take cities like this and turn them into cities like this, London today. And so I tell you that little story as an introduction to draw the analogy to SCORM. SCORM got us here. SCORM has allowed us to create an e-learning industry that is kind of is pretty impressive. If you take a look back 10 years ago where this industry was to where we are now, there's been a lot of progress. There are now thousands of companies that are all out there creating e-learning products, having things work together because we have a standard. Standards allow us to create marketplaces. They create a system whereby I can create something one time and sell it to many people that we couldn't do without a standard. And so where we are with Tin Can now is we have the ability to get here. A tin can isn't going to go out and build all these fancy buildings for us, but it's going to provide us the foundation, the underlying plumbing systems to go ahead and allow these things to be built. Things like mobile delivery, educational games, simulations, training in virtual worlds, tracking informal learning, a number of things that we can all do right now, but we can't make them work together, and there's no way to create reusable products because the standards aren't in place to do so. So that's why Tin Can is important and exciting. I'm going to go through now and tell you a little bit about what Tin Can is, where it's come from, a little bit of the history behind it, what's going on with it, and then we're going to dive into a little bit about some of the things that it's going to enable. What are those big shiny buildings that we're going to be creating? So first, what is the Tin Can API? At its most fundamental, the Tin Can API is simply the next generation of SCORM. We can think about this in a little bit of history. Back in about the year 2000, somewhere around there, ADL, which is a research laboratory within the Department of Defense, came up with SCORM. And if you don't know what SCORM is a technical standard that allows for e-learning content to work in learning management systems. And for its time, SCORM was actually pretty well thought out and kind of a little bit ahead of its time in the things that it enabled. But that's been 10, 12 years ago now. And so in 2010, ADL kind of started to realize, hey, we need to do something about this and create a next generation of SCORM. SCORM's long in the tooth. 10 years is an eternity. This is a different world. And so they started looking at a bunch of ways to do this. They looked at a lot of the efforts going on from other standards organizations. They looked at they conducted some of their own internal research efforts. And another thing that they did was they gave our company, Rustici Software, a research grant to go say, hey, you guys are really well connected in this industry and have a lot of good thoughts about this stuff. Why don't you go out and kind of talk about what you think the next generation of SCORM should look like? Specifically, how should we be tracking learning experiences? And so for about a year, we spent a lot of time talking to people in the industry, gathering requirements, gathering use cases, and kind of turned that back into what we thought was a pretty good solution to meet all of those, and called that the Tin Can API, presented it to the world and to ADL, and it was very well received. People are looking at this and saying, yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. It seems like a really good model. And so it's being adopted now and broadly pushed. If you hear ADL talk about it, they will talk about it as the Experience API component of their training and learning architecture, which is a long-winded way of saying the Tin Can API. So the first version of Tin Can was released about a year ago as a 0.8 release, or maybe a little less than a year ago, 9 months ago or so. And it's currently at a version called 0.95, which basically means, hey, this is getting really close to being a final release. There's a lot of early adopters jumping in and getting support for this. If you go to tincanapi.com, you can see a list of them. On the website, there's a few dozen or so vendors who have already started to adopt this and look at this model even before it's a finalized spec, which is it's really fantastic. And it's really got me excited about what has been a historically rather stagnant industry over the last few years, with not a whole lot of major innovation and major improvement, is now all of a sudden rallying around a new way of doing things, a new way that will produce a lot of innovative and exciting new products and technologies that we're going to dive into right now. So, what is the Tin Can API going to enable? The first thing that Tin Can will unlock is the ability to do mobile learning or training on mobile devices. And that's not to say we can't do this now, but if we try to do mobile learning right now, we quickly run into a problem. There's no way to track it because SCORM just doesn't fit well for mobile delivery. Now, I'm sure there's a few people on the call here saying, well, I have been able to do SCORM on mobile. My vendor does this, or we have a product that does that. And yes, there are kind of some ways to work around it and make it work. But at its core, SCORM is not going to it's going to get in the way. if you want to create a native app. It's going to get in the way if you want to go offline, or if your connection is intermittent, or if you just need something kind of at the point of demand. Now, a theme as we go through this talk is going to be not so much what Tin Can does, but how Tin Can gets out of the way and allows us to use the tools that are already at the modern web developers' disposal in an e-learning context. Mobile delivery is first amongst those. Mobile is one of those things we all know we need to be looking at. We all are trying to incorporate into our training programs, but it's just harder than it should be right now. And Tin Can is going to be changing that. The next thing that Tin Can's going to enable that kind of gets me a little excited is using simulations in our technology. And simulations can be a really immersive and engaging way to train people. And people are using simulations right now. But once you take a simulation that goes out of the web browser, or that can't be delivered in a small web package, SCORM again is getting in the way, and Tin Can's going to unlock that. It's going to unlock that in a few ways. The first is by allowing us to get out of the browser and connect in the fancy F-16 flight simulators that the Air Force uses, or even just the more robust desktop simulators. And what gets me really excited about this is I've been going to a conference called IATSEC for the last 6, 7, 8 years now. And IATSEC is a conference that I always want to bring my dad to, because IATSEC is a military training conference, and they have those F-16 flight simulators out on the floor. They have tank simulators you can play with, and helicopter simulators, and guns you can shoot, and all kinds of fun stuff to do with your dad. But what's been amazing about IATSEC is the first few years I went there, these simulators were all kind of very high-end, 7-figure type deals. But over the years, there's been a market increase in the number of vendors able to offer very high-fidelity simulators. That price point is coming down. The technology is becoming commoditized. This technology is at a point where it will soon be available to our training organizations with more realistic budgets. And Tin Can now will further accelerate that trend by allowing these things to be incorporated into our learning systems. And that's pretty exciting, to start thinking about this really immersive technology at our disposal all of a sudden. The next thing that Tin Can is going to enable us to include into our training program is educational or serious games. We all know gamification is a great way to increase engagement and those kind of things, but for a number of reasons, games aren't always well integrated into our learning management systems. For some of the same reasons as simulations, the technology isn't very compatible with web delivery, but also because the data model for the things we want to record in a game or a simulation doesn't always match the traditional SCORM notion of, I completed this e-learning course with a score of 85%. We want to know things like, I achieved this certain level, or I completed this certain simulation. Tin Can's going to start to unlock the ability to record things in a way that fits these models much better. I'm really excited about the possibility of incorporating educational games because I have young kids, and the images that are up on your screen here are some of my almost 7-year-old Tomorrow daughter's favorite things. This Princess Math game. It's just a silly little game on the iPad. It's no more than addition, subtraction, multiplication that any of you developers could code up in in a couple hours. But when she gets a problem right, she gets to dress up this fairy princess. And my daughter Amelia gets mad when she loses her high score on Princess Math. She's engaged in this. And Zeta over there, it's similar. It's a puzzle game. She'll just spend hours playing, and it's really intellectually engaging for her. But I start to think, why is it that Miss McMurray, her first grade teacher, can't see all this work that she's doing on her at home, and why can't she see that Amelia has really mastered addition already and probably doesn't need that in class? And I take that to a step farther. Why can't Miss McMurray have a classroom filled with iPads with Amelia playing Princess Math, and Jake playing Monster Truck Math, and Susie playing Fairy Math, and John playing Superhero Math, or whatever? How easy would it be to skin Princess Math for all of those different interests and have all these kids really engaged? And Why can't Miss McMurray have a dashboard sitting at the front of her classroom that shows Amelia, mastering addition so she can go be pushed to go take on some multiplication? Well, Johnny's struggling with how he adds his sevens, and so Miss McMurray can go over there and give him a few pointers. And a tin can is the type of thing that's going to enable all these thousands of simple games out in the App Store to start talking in these ways. And that is really exciting. That has a lot of power to transform how we teach our kids, and I'm personally pretty optimistic about that happening. The next thing that Tin Can starts to enable is using training in performance support situations. This video right here is kind of a personal reflection on my experience with performance support and what that means. A couple of years ago, I needed to weather strip all of the windows in my house, and so what I did was I went out to YouTube and researched a little bit, how do I weather strip windows? And the next day I went out to Home Depot and bought the supplies I needed, and it was about a week and a half before I got to have some free time on the weekend to actually do it. And got up into my other daughter Sienna's room, and I was sitting there, and I'd kind of forgotten some of the things I'd learned. What do I do with this stuff? And so I just pulled that YouTube video up right back on my phone, and essentially reminded myself, refreshed the training at the point of need, watched the video as I actually went and applied the weather stripping. And that really sunk in for me, the power of mobile training and also the training in the time of need. And right now there are many ways we can provide learning resources, performance support resources when they are needed. However, if we wanted to take our training resources, our SCORM conformance stuff, that's going to be really hard, because in SCORM we're tied into this big monolithic LMS where we need to go log in and register for a piece of training and launch it in there, and it's usually this big monster SCO that we can't just deep link into. And Tin Can's going to be changing that. Tin Can's going to get out of the way. It's going to allow us to launch training from anywhere, especially in the point of need. We're having a really interesting conversation with somebody who wants to put training into embedded sonar systems in our militaries, in our submarines, and that's pretty fascinating that we can start to deploy this stuff and still track it without a big monolithic LMS getting in the way. The next really exciting bit about Tin Can is the ability to track real-world activities. Learning doesn't just happen on a computer. Reading a book is a learning event. Going to a class or a conference session or a great webinar by your favorite Tin Can guru. These are all great learning experiences that we want to be able to track. In Tin Can, we're no longer tied to simply virtual learning environments that we're able to track. We will be able to track anything that can be represented as a learning activity. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So I'll just kind of stop there for now. Next interesting bit of thing we're going to be able to do with Tin Can is the ability to track offline or long-running content. In SCORM, this was, again, one of those things that was kind of hard, but could be done with some specialized software, specialized extensions to your learning management system. But in Tin Can, we're no longer dependent on a persistent internet connection, and so we'll be able to take the training on our phone, on our airplane, and still have it be there, still go through it quite normally without an LMS for support, and then have that data sync up later on. Similarly, SCORM is very tied to the notion of sitting down to take your training for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever it might be, on your computer over a kind of a set small period of time. But we really learn much more effectively when our training is spaced out over a longer period of time, where we're able to recall things later on. We can have some kind of time-based sequencing through our events. Again, Tin Can isn't going to all of a sudden create time-based learning, but it's going to get out of the way and allow us to create these programs that potentially deliver training and then re-engage you via maybe a text message or an email a few weeks later to help you recall your knowledge and bring you back into that learning environment. Another really nice, interesting bit about Tin Can is its ability to add security and authentication into the capturing of training results Many of the geekier SCORM people are very well aware of the fact that SCORM is inherently insecure, that any web developer who knows how to work with some common web development tools can hack SCORM. It's pretty easy. I can show you how to do it in about 10 or 15 minutes, and you can go trick any LMS into thinking that you have completed a course when you really haven't, and that you scored 100% and that you're just wonderful. And for the most part, SCORM is secure enough. The training we're doing with SCORM isn't high stakes enough that we're all that worried about the fact that it can be cheated. There are much bigger security vulnerabilities inherent in online training. My favorite is the one I like to call the buy your buddy a pizza security vulnerability, which is to say I'm just going to buy you a pizza if you'll take my training for me, and you're going to have no idea that it wasn't actually me out there taking the training. But what Tin Can's going to do is it's going to kind of up that level of security and authentication a little bit. It's going to make it possible for you to secure the communication between a learning experience provider and a learning record store. That's not to say it's going to automatically make everything secure. It's certainly possible for one to screw that up and be equally vulnerable, if not more vulnerable than you would be in SCORM. But it's got some provisions in there to tightly secure that communication and to validate that the thing making a statement, a tin can assertion, is in fact the person that they say they are. That should open up the door to a little bit higher stakes training through Tin Can than you might be comfortable with SCORM. A common theme running through a lot of those earlier posts was that Tin Can is going to allow us to get out of the browser, get out of the pure web-based world. And we talked about very early on about how SCORM, was a very kind of visionary thing for its time 12 years ago. And the vision there was everything's going to the web browser. The world's moving to the web. Let's make this a web browser-centric standard. And that was absolutely the right call for 12 years ago. But the pendulum is now starting to swing the other way, and we're moving out of the web browser back into the native apps on mobile phones and into these other technologies that are out there. And so it's time for something that works both in the web browser and outside of the web browser. So at a very high level, that is kind of the first layer of what makes Tin Can really interesting. There's a lot of good stuff in there. We're going to be able to move things forward. But when I talk about Tin Can, I often like to describe Tin Can using a layers of the onion analogy, where you can't keep peeling off layers and discovering deeper things. And all that stuff that I just talked about was really just the first layer of the Tin Can onion. These are the things that, on the surface, as a replacement standard for SCORM, there's a lot of good stuff. There's a bunch of new things that we can do. And that's, in and of itself, that is really exciting and should move things forward a whole lot. But the deeper layers actually get to be pretty exciting as well. And so we're going to start diving into those a little bit now. Layer number 2, everything is learning. We talked a little bit about the ability to track real-world experiences back in the first layer, and so what the question to put to you guys, to ask yourself in your head, is what percentage of learning actually happens in SCOs, in e-learning courses? It's infinitesimally small. What that you've learned in your life, what percentage of what you've learned in your life was learned in an e-learning course? It's well under 1%. For that matter, what percentage even happens in a classroom? Learning happens everywhere, both formally and informally. Anything can be a learning experience. We mentioned classrooms and webinars before, but reading an article on Wikipedia, watching a YouTube video, being mentored, mentoring somebody else, writing a blog post, not just reading the blog post, but writing the blog post, reading a book, making a mistake. A lot of these things are very valid learning experiences, and with Tin Can, we're going to be able to track them. We'll be able to track a person's holistic learning, not just online learning things, but anything that constitutes a valid learning experience can be tracked and start to be cataloged via Tin Can. So how might this work in the real world? We can't just all of a sudden say, I'm just going to put an insert into Mike's brain and start tracking everything that he's learning. That's a little bit too Big Brother-ish and a little bit too science fiction right now. But Increasingly, we're surrounded by electronic systems that are enhancing and enabling parts of our lives. And many of these systems can kind of start to passively track our learning experiences. And here's some examples up on the screen of how we might start to track learning experiences. The first in the top left is a screenshot from our tin can example bookmarklet. It's simply a bookmarklet that gives you an I learned this button in your web browser. And this is available and perfectly functional. You can go download it from Tin Can API and install it in your bookmarklet bar. And all this is when you're on a web page where you think that something is an interesting learning experience, you can click this I learned this button, and it will make a statement into your learning record store that says, Mike read this web page, or Mike watched this Khan Academy video. Really simple, easy way to start tracking the informal learning events that happen in our day-to-day lives. Down beneath that is another prototype that you can download from our Tin Can API site, which is a very simple Android app that's a book scanner. It's where if you read a book, you can have this app, turn the book over, and scan the barcode on the book with this app, and again, make a statement into your learning record store that says, I read this book. The third thing on the screen over on the right is a screenshot from an app called Tapestry by Float Learning. And I like to think of Tapestry as kind of a foursquare for learning events. You're at a conference session, you kind of check into the conference session and say, hey, I learned this. And so these are all very early stage imaginations for how we can start to capture all these informal learning events. Each of these kind of requires an action on the learner's part to choose to record the event. But you can start to imagine some of the more passive ones. For instance, this GoToWebinar could very easily have a button on it that says record learning event, where it goes and just scans all of your names from where you've registered and records to a learning record store that you guys all attended this webinar on Tin Can. Similarly, you can have a button in Google Calendar to record the people who have RSVP'd for a meeting, or maybe a discussion board that can assert your knowledge gain or experience sharing based on your activity within the discussion board. There are a lot of, another one of my favorites is, you register for conferences. When you go to a conference, you register for all the sessions. Those can very easily start to record those learning experiences. The point is there's a lot of ways that this can start to happen, and we're just starting to scratch the surface at the innovation that could be enabled to help us track informal learning events. So some of the key enablers for being able to track these informal learning events via Tin Can. The first is that the learning record store doesn't need to know about activities ahead of time anymore. In the SCORM world, to have something be tracked, you had to go import it into the LMS, register it in its catalog, and then explicitly assign it to a user, and then they could go take it. In Tin Can, you can just start making statements about learning experiences without prior knowledge of them, without having to go import them, and then start to have those tracked in your statement stream. Now, you still can go import and register things ahead of time, but you don't have to. The second key enabler, the experience to be tracked doesn't have to be originated in the LMS. So not only do you not need to know about it and import the activity ahead of time, to start using an activity, you don't need to go into your LMS and register for it and launch it from within your LMS. The activity can be just launched anywhere. It doesn't have to go into the LMS. You can simply launch it from a link, just launch it on the web, start and click on your bookmarklet. The third point is a little bit more subtle, but it's really powerful. In SCORM, the thing that asserted the result of a learning experience always had to be the same as the actual training content. They were one and the same. They were a SCO, and a SCO had both the educational material in it and all of the code to record information about that educational experience. In Tin Can, those two bits are now separate. The asserter of the learning experience can be different from the actual content. This means that anything in the world can be recorded as a learning experience now. To put it more concretely, anything on YouTube can be recorded as a learning experience without us having to go to Google and say, can you please make YouTube Tin Can conformant? That bookmarklet can simply record the stuff that's happening on YouTube. Now, a tighter integration with the YouTube API will give us more information about that, and it could give us some more detail about the experience within there. But we don't need to have that really tight coupling in order to start capturing. That allows anything on the web to be a learning experience. It allows anything, and it's an in-person event, to start being a learning experience. So that presents a lot of opportunity to get a really rich picture of how people are choosing to learn, what they're choosing to learn about, where they're going to learn. But it's also going to present some challenges. So we talked about tracking Khan Academy videos. Well, if we can track a Khan Academy video as a learning experience, then this is a learning experience as well. And well, for some of you, Gangnam Style might be a learning experience. I certainly learned a few things about the ironies of pop culture by watching it, but for the most part, it's going to be noise that we're going to filter out. And so we've got a challenge ahead of us of starting to figure out what constitutes a learning experience, and what do we care about, and how do we assemble a lot of data into an accurate picture of an individual's learning experiences. What do we want to learn from all this data? How do we filter out the signal from the noise? We're going to have a problem with a lot of data and figuring out what to do with it. Those are exciting problems, and they're exciting because big data gives us big opportunity. As we start to collect all of this data, some of the questions we can start asking ourselves are, how do people like to learn? If we can start to track not just the things we've told people to learn, but the things people are choosing to learn, can we start to say, oh, video is how this person chooses to go learn, but can we then say, well, this person might choose to go do video learning, but when they go actually talk to somebody in person, they actually get a much more effective learning experience. And can we start to look at the learning paths that our most effective performers take and use those to recommend learning paths to others? Conversely, what learning paths do the least effective performers take? And can we steer people away from those paths or improve those paths? Can we start to look at who are the best people at the skill of actually learning, because the skill of learning is hugely important to today's knowledge worker. Can we spot areas that people are choosing to learn about in our organization that we didn't expect before? Can we find topics that maybe we should start to institute formal training programs on, or that are just missing, or that people have an interest in? What's driving the interest? Does it mean that there's a new topic emerging that our company needs to start paying attention to because our employees are telling us that by what they're choosing to go study on their own time? Can we bring people together with complementary skills? I was talking to a former professor of mine at Vanderbilt about this concept, and he's into massively online open courses. And he was talking about the context of, well, if we know what people are choosing to learn about, then say we have the need to edit a Wikipedia page, can we use our knowledge of how and what people have learned about to bring together the set of people that would be best equipped to write a Wikipedia page on something? And that was an interesting slant on this that I hadn't thought about before. So as the second layer of the onion, Tin Can is going to open up a massive amount of new things that we can start to track, and a massive new pile of data about how people are learning. And the things we can do with that are really intriguing to start thinking about. The next layer of the Tin Can onion is what I like to call free the data. So in a SCORM world, SCORM course, a SCO, would report a lot of good data oftentimes, and it would then kind of go into your LMS, and then it would die a horrible death in this black hole pit where it would never come out, and you wouldn't be able to really analyze it and slice it and dice it and do the things that you wanted to. That's different in Tin Can. In Tin Can, data is required to, what goes in must also come out. Data is required to be free. The spirit of Tin Can is that data is able to be analyzed, to be moved around. A key concept in there is something called the Learning Record Store. And you've heard me throw out the term LRS a few times in this presentation already, and so now I'm going to tell you what the heck I mean by an LRS. The concept of a learning record store was born in the middle of the Tin Can project. It was actually born by a guy named Ben Clark, who's pictured here. And Ben is kind of our chief technical architect on the Tin Can spec. And Ben is the absolute perfect guy to write a technical specification, because not only is he just freaking brilliant, but Ben is also very, very precise. And to give you an instant idea of what Ben is like, this is our microwave at the office here. And when it dings, it says, "Your food is ready," and that drives Ben nuts because the microwave has no idea if the food inside it is actually ready. All the microwave knows is that your timer has elapsed. And so this is Ben, and this is how the LRS got invented. We were sitting in my office one day, Ben and I, geeking out about Tin Can, and specifically we were wrestling with what do we want to call the two things that communicate under the Tin Can API. And we quickly settled on as an experience provider as essentially the content, the thing providing the learning experience. But we didn't want to call the thing on the other end an LMS because it was really just the part of an LMS that receives all of this data. And LMSs these days are revamping themselves to talent management systems, and it didn't really have to be an LMS that was tracking this data. It could be an HR system or a talent management system, or it could be its own central database that was recording these learning experiences. So we came up with the name Learning Record Store. And we defined a learning record store, an LRS, as the thing that accepts all this Tin Can data, and it makes it available for other systems to read. And so we started presenting on Tin Can shortly after it was released, and introducing the concept of the learning record store as the geeky term for the thing that accepts Tin Can statements. And at the end of each of those presentations, a hand or two would go up in the back of the room and say, "Hey, where can I get an LRS? And do you have a learning record store? I'd like to buy an LRS." And so you're starting to see now people starting to think about an enterprise architecture with an independent learning record store, and you're starting to see those show up on the market as a new class of product, either as part of a learning management system or as a standalone type thing that simply sits there and makes this data accessible. And so the concept of an LRS can be thought of many ways. You see at the top left here, the LRS is simply the place where a lot of all these learning experiences record all of their data. What gets interesting, though, is that the learning record store can then send that data to multiple places, to learning management systems, specialized reporting tools, or even between other. It can even share data between different learning record stores. And this gets to be pretty exciting in terms of its implications that we're going to start talking about now, both in terms of how enterprise architectures are created and how LMSs of the future are architected. So the first thing that an independent or an LRS that allows us to read all of this data out is going to enable is specialized analysis. I was talking to some people a few months ago about Tin Can and how it could be extended to meet their specific industry needs. And they were saying, that's all well and good that we can have all these extensions, but my LMS is never going to recognize all of these extensions that we put out there. Well, the great part about Tin Can is that your LMS is always going to be your LMS, and an LMS is going to be designed to serve a large company very well across all of its divisions. Well, what if one division, let's go back to the flight simulator analogy. Let's take American Airlines. What if American Airlines has a big LMS X, and that LMS serves their pilots and their flight attendants and their maintenance crew and their customer service representatives and their managers and everybody, but the pilots really need a specialized report for how they're going through their flight simulator. Well, Tin Can statements with very specific aviation extensions on them could still very easily be stored in this corporate LMS, and you could still very easily record the fact that you completed the simulation into your transcript. But all of the specialized data could very easily be sucked out into a tool that just the flight training group uses. Specialized analysis and reporting tools will very easily now be bolted on to LMSs to extract out the information and look at it in ways that are meaningful to specific communities or specific ways of looking at things. And analyzing a flight simulator is a great example, but we can also use it to analyze pathways through learning and provide specialized reports for compliance needs that are unique to a certain organization. And really, you can just start to use your imagination of all the different ways you can start to extract this data and start to look at it. Another interesting one is content analytics. In Tin Can, data can travel from LRS to LRS, or data can be sent to multiple LRSs at the beginning. And this is a screenshot of our Google Analytics site on the Tin Can API, for the Tin Can API site. And we get all kinds of great data about how people are using the website. With Tin Can, it's going to be very easy to start feeding the data for how your e-learning content is used back to the content author, so they can maintain their own repository of how people are using this stuff across many different organizations, start to look at the areas of what's effective in their content, what's not effective, and do the same types of things that we all routinely do on our websites now to their e-learning content. Another interesting one, I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation, usually at a Maisie event it seems like, where somebody works at big company X and they say, man, we have 18 different LMSs at our organization, we just want to consolidate them into one, but there's so many turf wars, we're never going to be able to do it, and it's just a big old mess because we just want to bring all this data together. Well, the system-to-system communication across learning record stores is going to provide a step in solving that problem. We're never going to solve the bureaucratic and political mess of getting people to give up their LMS and to deal with policies and procedures. But what we are going to be able to provide is the interoperable technology to have all of this data feeding into one central place, even if a division wants to keep a separate system for their specific needs. Learning record stores can send data to other learning record stores, and when you have a learning record store as part of an LMS, that LMS will then be able to send all of its data to another LMS or to a central place, and that has some pretty interesting implications for how we think about how we're designing our learning systems. The next really interesting possibility for now that we have free data that will allow us to take data across systems is training data portability. My wife is a physical therapist, and she has to do a bunch of continuing education credit, and also she has to take training on the medical billing systems that they're using at the hospital, and this and that policy about HIPAA and those kind of things. But if she was to leave her job at Williams Medical Center and go work at, say, Vanderbilt University Medical Center down the road, that training day is going to stay at Williams Medical Center, and she's going to go have to take a bunch of useless training about stuff she already knows about. And why don't those training records move with her? There's going to be plenty of bureaucratic and political reasons, again, that maybe Williams Medical Center doesn't want to share their training data with Vanderbilt, but with Tin Can, they're now going to have a very simple technical pathway to do that. And I would argue that it's in both of their interests to do so, because Williamson might be hesitant to share stuff about employees that are leaving, but they've got just as many employees coming in for whom they want to know about their prior experiences. A, because they could very well stand to benefit from not retraining them on stuff they have already been trained on, but B, because the prior training and learning experiences of an individual are hugely informative for who they are, and you might learn some things about what they know that you don't even know that they know that could come in handy. It could be really nice to know that somebody had a side course on how to speak basic Spanish, and it would be nice to know the people in your organization who speak Spanish when you have a Hispanic population coming into your hospital. If you take that, though, to its kind of next logical conclusion, why is it that my employer owns my training records? Isn't that my data? Isn't that information about what I have done? Isn't that kind of like my resume? Isn't my set of learning experiences really unique to me? And so why is it that we're sending all this learning experience data to my company's LMS first? Why aren't we sending it to my personal data locker and then allowing my employer to read from that about the sets of things that I care for them to know about? And as an employer, I want to know about my potential employees' kind of holistic learning experience. I want to know about your skill at learning. I really want, if I get two people who walk in the door, both of whom have equal competency in Java programming, and one of them learned it in 6 months and the other one learned it in 10 years, you know pretty darn well who I'm going to hire. I want the guy who can learn something in 6 months, because what they're going to need to know is going to change 8 times over the next 5 years at my company. I want the guy who can learn new things, pick them up quickly, and who has demonstrated the ability to do that over the past. I want to see their full picture of what they've learned and how they've learned it over the years. And so, could your personal data locker, your personal set of learning records, start to be more informative than your resume in some sense? These are some really interesting things that we're starting to think about and put together some software around, and I suspect you'll be hearing a bunch more about that from us here pretty soon. But there's plenty of bureaucracy and politics, again, to get in the way of this model taking forth, but it seems to be the right model for us as an industry going forward, and we're optimistic about its ability to start to take hold over the next few years. So that's the third layer of the tin can onion, the ability for this data to move around seamlessly between systems, and that really starts to open up some interesting possibilities. Layer 4, the final layer of the tin can onion, and this is kind of what I've labeled it correlate performance with training, but I also start to call it the Holy Grail layer. Tin can, you've heard me say tin can is a series of statements. And so the way tin can works, we're going to go under the hood now. We're going to kind of give you the what is tin can, how does it work spiel. Tin can is basically captures learning experiences by a series of statements. Each of those statements takes the form of I did this. There's an actor, the I, a verb, the did, and an object, the this. So in a traditional e-learning course, it would be Mike completed back safety training, or Mike scored 85% on back safety training. These statements can be extended to start talking about a lot of the things we talked about earlier. So, Mike completed barrel roll in Flight Simulator, or Mike performed CPR on the CPR dummy. Well, for some of you, this structure might look familiar. The I did this structure that tin can is based off of is based on something called activity streams. Activity streams are a standard that we didn't invent. It was created by Facebook, Microsoft, Google, IBM, et al. As a way of capturing activity across the enterprise. And specifically, it started for capturing activity on social networks. And if you go look at your Facebook wall is basically just a big activity stream. Mike posted picture. Beth liked picture. Tim commented on picture. And where this becomes interesting is the Tin Can API is simply an extension to the activity stream specification that gives it some information specific to learning. Well, activity streams are all fine and dandy in the fact that they're used on Facebook, but they're also starting to be used across enterprise systems. For instance, I found out a couple weeks ago that Oracle Financial System apparently reports activity streams of what people are doing within the Oracle Financial System. This starts to mean that the training data that we are capturing can now be stored in the same place in the format as the actual job performance data. So take the Oracle Financial System example. We can go give a person an e-learning course on the financial system and capture John completed e-learning course on Oracle Financial System. And then we can give them a software simulation. So John finished a software simulation on Oracle Financial System. And then John successfully used the Oracle Financial System, and John made a general ledger entry, and John successfully created an invoice. And we can then start to tie how John is using the system to the training John received on this system. And when we can do that, we can start to correlate, figure out which training is effective, which training is leading to the actual organizational outcomes that we need. And this is a little bit in the future. I mentioned activity streams are starting to be used across these enterprise systems, and by that I really mean started. It's going to take a little while for that to happen, but the trend is there. The momentum is starting to build towards doing that. At the same time that the trend is starting to build towards tin can being used to capture learning data. And so, over the next few years, if these trends continue, we're going to start to see all these things coming together. And the possibilities for tying all of this data together, for figuring out an actual return on investment of our training, for figuring out which training is actually effective, are pretty phenomenal to think about. So that's the fourth layer of the onion. And in that, I kind of started to tease you with, how does this thing work under the hood? What is the Tin Can API? And so for the next 2 or 3 minutes, if you're not a geek, you can get a sip of water and tune out for a second. We're going to talk a little bit about how this works at a very high level. If you want to take a deep dive, let us know, and we can do that with you on a separate webinar, or you can just get a lot of great information on tincanapi.com. At its highest level, the Tin Can API is a REST API that carries a JSON payload. And for the non-techies who aren't getting a glass of water right now, what that basically means is this is using the same technology that every other modern web application is using to communicate with other web applications. We just kind of said, hey, this is the way the world's working, let's do the same thing and not be stupid and try and reinvent the wheel. The main portion of the Tin Can API is something that allows you to record sets of statements and then read them back. All of those statements are simply activity streams of the form, I did this. And so a Tin Can API call would look something like, save this set of statements of, Mike started course, Mike answered this question, Mike scored this %, Mike passed the course. As I mentioned before, those set of statements, each of the components of them is very highly extensible. So the way that we identify the actor is very extensible. We can use an email address, you could use an OpenID, you could use a system identifier, which you could use a Twitter handle to start identifying people. The verbs that can be expressed are also very extensible. There's a core set of 8, 10, or 12, I'm not sure exactly which are defined now by ADL. These are the core set for doing traditional stuff that we all know and love, but very quickly it becomes apparent that we need a much bigger set to start to define all of the things we've talked about here on this webinar. Those additional things to talk about are all can be defined by communities as we go forth, and even by individuals who want to start providing richer expressions of things. And the policies and procedures around defining new verbs are still being worked out, but the technological parts are there. Similarly, the objects, the structure for defining the learning experiences is very broad as well. So that's enough for the under the hood part, very high level skim there. If you want a deeper dive, just let us know. We're happy to do that with you guys. So the big takeaway from this right now is this is happening, this is real, it's happening now. All the vendors that you see up here are people who have adopted or committed to adopt Tin Can before the spec is even finalized, and that's pretty phenomenal. But this is just the tip of the iceberg that you see right here. I dove into our CRM system the other day, and we've got 230 active conversations going on with vendors right now at one stage or another. We're thinking about adopting this. To give you some context, we have 1,800 people register for this webinar. It looks like 800 something of you have showed up for it. The interest in this stuff is phenomenal, and it is only growing every day. It's been a phenomenal last few months to watch people embrace this for many of the reasons that we've talked about here already. And so the parting sentiment here is just do it. Just go out and start diving into this stuff, start playing around with it, develop some prototypes, kick it around, encourage your vendors to adopt it. There's so much opportunity, so many new things to be created, so much innovation that is only just getting started. This industry is about to get blown wide open by this. I'm very convinced this is going to be an enormous catalyst for innovation within the industry, and I'm just got nothing but excitement about it, and I'd encourage you guys to go embrace it, go kick the tires, go tell us what we've done wrong, and give us feedback and be part of it. The train's leaving the station now. It's time to get on board with this thing and start making it a reality. So we've got a few minutes left. This is all of our contact information. You want to know more about it, you want to email me, tweet me, go to the website, learn more. And there's ADL's site as well. They've got a bunch of great information as well there. Jeff and Andy have started posting some of your questions for me here in the chat panel, and so I'm just going to start clicking on a few of them and going through them to fill up the remaining part of the hour. If you again, if you have more questions, go ahead and post them in there. If we don't get to them here, we will get to them offline and post all of this for you guys on the web. Question here, can the Tin Can API do SCORM for all LMS and all SCORM versions? And so I read that to say, is Tin Can API backwards compatible with SCORM? I said the Tin Can API can do everything that SCORM could do, and it can do more. But it's not going to be strictly backwards compatible. If an LMS was to say, I'm Tin Can compatible but not SCORM compatible, your SCORM courses will not work in that LMS. And the way I look at that question is, akin to saying, is a DVD compatible with VHS? No, it's not. You can't put a VHS tape into your DVD player, but your home entertainment system is going, if you're like me, I had a VHS player until about a year ago alongside my DVD player. Similarly, the LMS is going to contain both, the SCORM player for the foreseeable future, because there's too much SCORM content out there. It's not going to go away anytime soon. Then they're also going to add the ability to track Tin Can content alongside that. How will Tin Can be governed? That's a really good question. So I talked about the history of Tin Can a little bit and how it came out of a research project that Rustici Software did. We since turned the product of that research product over to ADL, and it is now theirs to own and control and go forward. They're taking a very open approach to the governance of Tin Can. There are weekly conference calls where anybody is welcome to participate and talk about what's going on with the spec and where it should be going, provide feedback. There's information linked from the ADL site right over there. Their intent is, after they get it to a stable point, whether that be 1.0 or somewhere thereafter, to turn it over to an open standards organization. They do not exactly know which organization that will be yet, but that is very much the intent. Next question. I'm having trouble with the verbosity and open character of the API. For human readability, this is great, but an LMS or developer, it's going to be troublesome to manage these results and do anything other than just list the records. It's a great question. So yes, if we get a bunch of unstructured data that's coming in here, that's a problem. And we talked about that with the Gangnam Style slide of how do we start to differentiate what is meaningful learning experience and what is not. And similarly, how do we decide what to do with that data? Where the rubber meets the road here is, how do I decide to put something on a transcript? And the answer to that is there's going to be a verb completed that will be kind of the one that will have action associated with it in a Tin Can world. And the logic should actually be pretty simple along those, but what do you do with the rest of it? And the intention here is actually that we're opening up a world from what I'll call a managed learning world, where it was always just go do this and now I'm going to take an action in my system to say you did that, to you're going to learn anywhere. And now the job of the system that is tracking this is to use that data in intelligent ways. And in my mind, there are several ways I can use that data in intelligent ways and several ways I can add value. The first is, I think there is value simply in the list, simply in the activity stream of going and skimming what this person has done. You can argue over the amount of value that offers, but similar to just going and skimming a Facebook wall, I can get a pretty accurate picture of that person by skimming their Facebook wall. I can get a pretty accurate picture of what a person thinks is important and what they are interested in and how they learn by skimming their Tin Can stream. So that's, in and of itself, I believe the list has some inherent value. Where I think you get into the really interesting things you can start to do with this data are some of those, those other layers of analysis where I can start to look at it in a larger context of the entire organization and start to mine a lot of this unstructured data for meaning. And those are some hard problems, but they're the problems that are kind of the best and brightest are working on right now. they're all working at Facebook, unfortunately. But the problem of taking masses of unstructured data and turning it into useful information by extracting patterns, applying machine learning to it, those are all really interesting things to think about. What about privacy? Another good one here. What about privacy when it comes to tracking everything? A great question. And like the question is the same as the question facing the rest of our day-to-day life. Increasingly we're being tracked when we want to, when we don't want to, and a lot of times we share more than we should. And Tin Can is really no different in that regard. I'm not suggesting anywhere that Tin Can is going to be tracking things that shouldn't be tracked, that couldn't already be tracked in a not interoperable way. But it is going to open up some doors for things to be tracked easier or more easily, whatever the right word is. And so, yeah, there are definitely some things to think about there. We're starting to get into a little bit of some Big Brother territory our industry hasn't been into before, the rest of the world has to grapple with, and we need to be very cognizant of that. I think, in my mind, the personal data locker world is a little bit of a solution for that, where all of your records go to under your control first, and then you decide what to share with others. But I don't know, and it's going to be really interesting to see how the industry plays that. I've got time for one more question here. Let's see. Let's pick one here. I think we already talked about that one. Can we get a recorded version of this webinar? That's a nice, easy one to conclude on. Yes, we will be posting a recording of this webinar to the website shortly, and I expect we will email all of the registrants to let them know that it is available, along with answers to as many of the questions as we can get up there. So that is the end of our hour. I wanted to thank you guys all for coming and let you know that we're happy to answer further questions about this stuff. I hope to have gotten you thinking, and I hope to have generated more questions than I've answered with this presentation. So feel free to contact us anytime. You've got us on Twitter. You've got our website. Hit us up however you feel most comfortable. And thank you for coming again, and good luck to you all.